Opening, the pattern. Some signals are created to be discovered. They wait in the noise, hoping someone will tune in, decode them, give them meaning. But there are others, signals that do not wait to be found. They return on their own. Buried deep inside decades of radio monitoring logs is a frequency that does not behave like a transmission should. It does not drift with time. It does not weaken. It does not collide with known sources or follow the rules of interference. It appears suddenly, remains perfectly stable, and then vanishes, leaving no trace behind. What makes it impossible to ignore is not its content, but its timing. Every 30 years without fail, the signal reappears. Not approximately, not within a margin of error. Exactly. Same frequency, same duration, same structure, as if time itself were part of the mechanism. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Radio history is filled with anomalies, glitches, reflections, atmospheric distortions mistaken for intent. But anomalies do not repeat themselves with precision. They do not arrive on schedule. And they do not do so across multiple continents at the same moment. This signal does. It does not announce its presence. There is no surge, no warning spike, no buildup. 1 second frequency is empty, filled only with static. The next, it is occupied, clean, controlled, deliberate. And then 6 minutes and 42 seconds later, it is gone. No decay, no fade out, just absence. What unsettles researchers is not what the signal contains, but what it ignores. It does not respond to our attempts to trace it. It does not change when observed. It does not adapt, evolve, or correct itself based on who is listening. It behaves as if being heard is irrelevant, as if the signal is not meant for discovery, but for confirmation. Confirmation that something has happened before, that a cycle has already begun, that this moment has already existed. Those who first noticed the pattern wrote a simple note in the margins of the archive, one that would go unnoticed for decades. This signal is not broadcasting information, it is keeping time. And if that is true, then the most disturbing question is not where the signal comes from, it is why it keeps returning. Because whatever sends it does not ask whether we are ready, it only checks whether we are still here. Part 1. The first recording. The first time the signal was documented, no one thought it mattered. In 1957, the world was crowded with noise. Radio frequencies were saturated with military tests, experimental broadcasts, Cold War surveillance, and atmospheric interference that engineers were still learning to understand. Anomalies were common. Strange echoes, ghost signals, reflections off the ionosphere, most of them were logged, labeled, and forgotten. The signal that would later be called the pattern entered the record quietly, without drama. It appeared on a routine overnight monitoring shift at a government-operated listening station, one of dozens tasked with cataloging unidentified transmissions. The operators on duty were not searching for anything specific. Their job was simple: record, timestamp, and move on. At 0217 local time, a narrowband signal emerged on an otherwise empty frequency. At first, it looked ordinary. The waveform was clean, too clean perhaps, but not unheard of. There was no distortion, no bleed from neighboring channels, no sign of atmospheric scattering. The signal sat precisely where it appeared, stable and centered, as if it had been placed there deliberately. The operator marked it as a possible test transmission. Then he noticed something odd. The signal did not fluctuate. Most broadcasts, even controlled ones, show minor variations, tiny imperfections caused by equipment, distance, or environmental conditions. This one showed none. The amplitude remained constant. The pulse spacing never drifted. Every cycle repeated with mechanical precision. Still, that alone was not enough to raise alarms. What came next was, after 6 minutes and 42 seconds, the signal stopped, not gradually, not with static or interference. It ended between one pulse and the next, leaving the frequency perfectly empty, as if it had never been occupied at all. The operator logged the event, labeled it unidentified narrowband transmission, and archived the recording. No follow-up was requested. No escalation occurred. By the standards of the time, the anomaly did not justify further attention. Except for one detail, the operator added a handwritten note to the log. Open quote, "No observable source behavior. Signal appears complete, not interrupted." Close quote. It was an unusual phrasing. Most unexplained transmissions were described as lost, cut off, or interrupted. This one felt intentional, finished. Weeks later, another technician reviewed the tape. Out of curiosity, he ran a basic spectral analysis. The results were unremarkable at first glance. No embedded voice, no recognizable code, no modulation indicating data transfer. Just layered pulses repeating in a rigid structure. But the timing caught his attention. Every pulse aligned perfectly with the internal clock of the recording system. Not synchronized, aligned, as if the signal knew when it was being recorded. The technician dismissed the thought immediately. Machines do not know. Coincidences happen. He wrote a brief note, filed the tape under unresolved anomalies, and moved on. Years passed. The station upgraded its equipment. Analog systems were replaced. Staff rotated. Shelves were cleared. Thousands of tapes were transferred to long-term storage, boxed, labeled, and forgotten. The 1957 recording became one artifact among many, unremarkable, unexamined, until someone noticed the date. In the late 1980s, a junior archivist was digitizing old recordings as part of a preservation project. He was not looking for patterns. He was following a checklist. When he loaded the 1957 tape, the metadata caught his eye. The exact timestamp, the duration, the precision. Out of curiosity, he searched the database for similar anomalies. He found another entry, different year, different station, same frequency, same duration. At first, he assumed it was a clerical error, a duplicated file mislabeled decades apart. But when he pulled the second recording, the truth became harder to ignore. The signals were identical, not similar, not derived, identical down to the microsecond. Even the background noise, the faint hiss of the recording equipment, matched. Which should have been impossible. Analog recordings degrade. Tape stretches, equipment changes, environmental noise differs. No two recordings made 30 years apart should ever align so perfectly, unless they were not recordings of a broadcast, but recordings of the same event. That realization forced the archivist to look back at the original documentation. The first recording had not been incomplete. It had not been cut short. It had been whole, contained, finished. What had once seemed like a routine anomaly began to look like a fixed point in time. Further review revealed something even more unsettling. The 1957 signal did not appear in isolation. In the hours surrounding its appearance, other stations, unconnected, geographically distant, had logged brief, unexplained spikes on nearby frequencies. Nothing sustained enough to trigger investigation. Nothing clearly related. But the timestamps aligned, as if something had brushed past the edge of detection everywhere at once. No investigation had followed. No cross-referencing had been done. The technology of the era simply wasn't built to see patterns across decades. And perhaps that was the point, because if the signal had been understood in 1957, it would not have been dismissed. And if it had not been dismissed, someone might have noticed what it truly represented. The first recording was not a mistake. It was not an experiment gone wrong. It was a marker, a starting line, not for us, but for whatever was counting. And it left behind just enough evidence to be found later when time itself would reveal the pattern. The people who first heard the signal never knew what they had recorded, but the signal knew. It had already been there before, and it would be there again. Part 2, The Return. By the time the signal returned, the world had changed. In 1987, radio monitoring was no longer a blunt instrument. Digital analysis had begun to replace analog guesswork. Computers could compare waveforms, align timestamps, and reveal discrepancies that once went unnoticed. Patterns that had been invisible in the 1950s could now be identified within minutes. Which is why the return of the signal did not remain hidden for long. It appeared quietly, just as it had before, on an unremarkable frequency during an overnight monitoring window when human attention was minimal and automated systems carried most of the burden. There was no warning, no buildup. One moment, static. The next, structure. The system flagged it as an anomaly within seconds. At first, technicians assumed it was a malfunction. Equipment errors were still common in early digital systems, especially during long, unattended runs. A corrupted clock, a misaligned filter, something mundane. But the anomaly did not behave like an error. The frequency was precise. The signal strength was consistent. The waveform was stable beyond expected tolerances. And most unsettling of all, the duration matched something already in the archives. 6 minutes, 42 seconds. When the signal ended, it did so cleanly, without tapering or interference, leaving behind a silence that felt deliberate rather than accidental. The comparison began almost immediately. Engineers pulled older records, searching for precedents. Within hours, someone retrieved the 1957 tape. It was still stored in a climate-controlled archive, preserved more out of institutional habit than perceived importance. The two recordings were placed side by side. At first glance, they appeared similar. Then the software aligned them. The result should not have been possible. Every pulse matched, every interval aligned, every microvariation identical. Not statistically identical, perfectly identical. Even the minor irregularities, once thought to be artifacts of recording equipment, were present in both. The same slight asymmetry in the pulse edge, the same microscopic timing deviation at the same moment in the sequence. Those imperfections were not noise. They were part of the signal, which meant the signal had not been recreated. It had been repeated. The room went quiet as the implications settled in. This was not a broadcast subject to distance, degradation, or chance. It was not something that had traveled through space to reach the receivers. If it had, there would have been variation. There would have been loss. Instead, it behaved like a fixed recording being replayed into reality. But no one could explain how or from where. Triangulation attempts began immediately. Multiple stations across different regions were asked to review their logs from the same window. What they found only deepened the mystery. The signal had been received simultaneously across vast distances. There was no detectable delay, no shift in phase, no directional bias. It did not arrive from anywhere. It simply appeared everywhere that was listening. Traditional radio logic collapsed under that observation. Signals are supposed to move, they propagate, they weaken. They arrive at different times depending on distance. This one did none of that. It behaved less like a transmission and more like a condition, as if for 6 minutes and 42 seconds, the frequency itself had changed its nature. Internal discussions grew tense. Some engineers suggested a classified test, something beyond their clearance. Others proposed a rare atmospheric phenomenon, though no model could account for the precision or repetition. One researcher raised a question that made the room uncomfortable. What if this isn't being sent? What if it's being triggered? The idea was dismissed publicly, but privately it lingered. If the signal was not traveling, then perhaps it was not originating in space at all. Perhaps it was embedded, latent, waiting for a specific moment to emerge. That moment, disturbingly, had been exactly 30 years after the first recording. The date alignment was too precise to ignore. Statisticians were consulted. They calculated the probability of two identical unexplained signals occurring on the same frequency with the same duration 30 years apart. The result was effectively zero. Someone finally said what everyone else had been avoiding. This means it's going to happen again. The question was not if, but when. Attention turned to the content itself. Analysts dissected the signal layer by layer, hoping to find a clue, a payload, something that justified its persistence. There was nothing. No encoded language, no hidden image, no data compression, just repetition, structured, deliberate, and empty, which raised an even more troubling possibility. If the signal carried no information, then its purpose was not communication, it was synchronization. A clock does not explain itself. It does not persuade. It simply marks time. And clocks do not care who is watching. One senior analyst, reviewing the comparison late at night, noticed something subtle. When the 1957 and 1987 recordings were overlaid, the alignment was not merely exact, it was anticipatory. The signal did not adjust to the recording systems. The recording systems adjusted to it. Their internal clocks, supposedly independent, had drifted slightly over decades. But during the signal, they corrected themselves, snapping into alignment as if guided by an external reference, as if the signal was more accurate than the instruments measuring it. That observation never made it into the official report. Neither did the unease that followed, because if the signal was precise enough to correct human technology, then it was not bound by it. The return of the signal shattered the assumption that the first recording had been a fluke. it revealed something far more unsettling. The signal was persistent, patient, and exact. It did not evolve. It did not improve. It did not respond to scrutiny. It behaved like something that had already finished its work and was simply checking back in. By the end of the investigation, the signal was no longer referred to as an anomaly. It was called a cycle. And once something is recognized as a cycle, the mind cannot stop counting. 30 years had passed, which meant there were only 30 more before it would return again. And this time, people would be waiting. Part 3. No source. Once the return of the signal was confirmed, the next step seemed obvious. Find where it came from. Every unexplained transmission, no matter how strange, is assumed to have an origin, a transmitter, a reflection, a fault in the system. Radio science is built on the idea that signals move from one point to another, even if that movement is poorly understood. So the investigation began with confidence and ended with silence. Within hours of the 1987 event, coordinated triangulation was initiated. Monitoring stations across multiple countries were asked to synchronize their data and compare arrival times, phase shifts, and signal strength. With enough points of reference, any transmission, no matter how distant, should reveal a direction. This one did not. There was no measurable delay between stations separated by thousands of kilometers, no leading edge, no trailing echo. The signal appeared everywhere at once, as if distance did not apply. Engineers recalibrated their instruments, assuming an error. Timestamps were checked. Atomic clocks were consulted. Systems were rebooted, then checked again. The result did not change. The signal did not propagate. It manifested. Attempts were made to model it as a near-Earth phenomenon. Ionospheric reflection was ruled out immediately. Such signals distort, scatter, and arrive unevenly. Solar interference was dismissed just as quickly. Solar noise is chaotic, not structured. Satellites were checked, both civilian and classified. None matched the frequency, the timing, or the behavior. No aircraft, no ground transmitter, no orbital source. The signal left no footprint. One physicist involved in the analysis described it as a broadcast without a path. That description never appeared in any official document. As days passed, the search expanded. Records from underwater cables, seismic sensors, and even experimental neutrino detectors were reviewed, not because there was a clear rationale, but because nothing else made sense. If the signal was not traveling through air or space in a conventional way, then perhaps it wasn't traveling at all. That idea was uncomfortable. Signals are events. They happen, then pass. But this one behaved more like a state, something that turned on, remained stable, and then turned off again, as if reality itself briefly allowed it. The most disturbing realization came not from what was detected, but from what was not. There was no noise floor interaction. Normally, a signal must contend with the environment it enters. It pushes against background radiation, atmospheric interference, and the limitations of the receiving equipment. This signal did none of that. It sat perfectly within the frequency band, untouched by surrounding chaos. It did not overwrite static. It replaced it. For 6 minutes and 42 seconds, the frequency ceased to behave like empty space and behaved like a container. Some researchers began to describe the event using language that made others uneasy. They spoke of activation rather than transmission, of appearance rather than arrival. One internal memo asked a question that was later removed. If this signal has no source, are we correct in calling it a signal at all? The memo was never answered. Further analysis revealed another anomaly. While the signal itself showed no variation between stations, the equipment receiving it did. Minor differences in hardware configuration produced slightly different internal responses. Small timing corrections, calibration shifts, even error logs that appeared only during the signal window. It was as if the signal was interacting with the systems, not as input, but as reference, not something to be measured, something that did the measuring. One engineer noticed that during the event, several monitoring systems briefly synchronized with each other, despite having no network connection. Their internal clocks aligned more closely than at any other point in their operational history. After the signal ended, the clocks drifted apart again. The alignment was temporary, intentional. That observation was quietly buried. As the investigation dragged on, frustration set in. Science depends on repeatability and causation. This phenomenon offered neither. It could not be provoked. It could not be extended. It could not be traced backward. All that could be done was wait. And waiting raised a question no one wanted to articulate. If the signal had no source, then it was not being sent to us, which meant it might not be for us at all. Some theorized that the signal could be a residual effect, an echo of an event long past, repeating because it was trapped in some unknown medium. Others suggested an automated system, long abandoned, still following instructions no one remembered giving. But even those explanations failed to address the precision. Echoes decay, machines drift, systems break. This signal did none of those things. It behaved as if it existed outside the processes that degrade everything else. The more the team searched for a source, the clearer one thing became. The absence was not a failure of detection. It was a property of the phenomenon. The signal was not hiding its origin. It did not have one, at least not one that could be located in space. This led to a final, unsettling hypothesis, one that was never formally endorsed, but quietly discussed in private conversations and late-night notes. What if the signal was not moving through space, but through time? What if the reason it could not be triangulated was because it did not originate anywhere, but anywhen? The 30-year interval suddenly took on a different meaning. Not a coincidence, not a countdown, a recurrence, like a calendar date that returns regardless of who observes it. Under that framework, the signal was not something that happened to the world. It was something the world passed through. A moment that arrived, existed briefly, and then withdrew, unchanged by observation. That would explain everything. The identical recordings, the lack of propagation, the indifference to listeners. It would also explain why searching for a source was pointless. You cannot triangulate a date, you can only mark it. By the end of the inquiry, the official conclusion was vague and unsatisfying. The signal was classified as an unresolved anomaly with no identifiable origin. Funding was reduced, teams were reassigned, the world moved on. But a few people could not. They had seen something that violated a foundational assumption, that every signal comes from somewhere. This one did not, it simply arrived. And that meant the next time it appeared, it would not be announcing itself. It would be reminding, not of a place, but of a moment that was always coming back. Part 4. The Listeners. Once it became clear that the signal could not be traced, contained no information, and resisted every conventional method of analysis, interest should have faded. Officially, it did. But curiosity does not disappear simply because it is inconvenient. It only changes shape. A small group of researchers, engineers, analysts, and theoreticians who had been closest to the investigation continued to study the signal quietly, outside formal channels. They shared notes privately, compared impressions, and debated theories that had no place in reports or funding proposals. Over time, their focus shifted. If the signal could not be understood technically, perhaps it could be understood experientially. The idea was never written down as a proposal. It emerged gradually, almost reluctantly. Instead of dissecting the signal, they would listen to it, not as background noise, not as data, but as a complete event, from beginning to end, without interruption. This was unusual. In professional settings, listening to raw signals was considered inefficient, even unscientific. Analysts worked with visualizations, filters, abstractions. The sound itself was rarely emphasized, but the group believed something important might be lost in translation. The first session took place months after the 1987 return in a controlled environment. No distractions, no multitasking, just the recording played at its original frequency, unaltered. 6 minutes and 42 seconds, nothing dramatic happened. There was no sudden revelation, no hidden voice emerging from the static, no emotional outburst. The signal sounded exactly as it always had, layered pulses, evenly spaced, precise to the point of sterility. Yet afterward, the listeners struggled to describe what they felt. Not fear, not confusion, familiarity. Several of them used the same word independently, which unsettled them more than any technical anomaly ever had. It felt remembered, one researcher said. Another described a sensation of alignment. as if something inside his perception had briefly settled into place. A third dismissed the experience entirely, until he realized he had been holding his breath the entire time. They did not publish these impressions. They barely discussed them. Subjective experience was unreliable, easily contaminated by suggestion. Everyone involved understood that, so they listened again. Over the following months, more sessions were held, different rooms, different equipment, different combinations of people. Always the same rules: full playback, no interruption, no analysis until the signal ended. Patterns began to emerge. Listeners reported a subtle compression of time. The signal did not feel long or short, it felt complete, as if its duration was not measured in minutes, but in necessity. Several noted that their sense of when the signal would end was strangely accurate, despite having no conscious awareness of the timestamp. Others described a growing conviction that the signal was not new, that they had heard it before, not in memory, not in dreams, somewhere deeper. One participant, a mathematician with no background in audio analysis, withdrew from the group after 3 sessions. He offered no explanation, only a brief message: "I don't think this is for us to examine." Another became fixated. He began requesting access to earlier recordings, insisting on hearing the 1957 tape specifically, despite being told repeatedly that it was indistinguishable from the 1987 version. He listened to it dozens of times alone, often late at night. When asked why, he said, "I'm waiting for the part I missed." No one could say what that meant. As the months passed, subtle changes became harder to ignore. Listeners grew distant, not abruptly but gradually. Conversations became shorter, interests narrowed. Several abandoned unrelated projects without explanation, focusing almost exclusively on the signal and its implications. It was not obsession in the conventional sense. There was no excitement, no urgency. It was resignation, as if they had accepted something they could not articulate. One researcher began documenting his thoughts in a private journal. His entries grew increasingly abstract, moving away from technical language toward metaphor. "The signal doesn't speak," one entry read. "It waits, or maybe it doesn't wait at all. Maybe it assumes." Another entry written weeks later simply stated, "Listening feels like arriving late to something already underway." Then the disappearances began. The first was subtle enough to be explained away. A researcher took an extended leave of absence, citing health reasons. Emails went unanswered, calls were not returned. Eventually, his position was quietly filled. The second moved away without notice, leaving behind equipment, notes, and an unfinished manuscript that no one could make sense of. By the third, people started to talk. These were not dramatic vanishings, no crime scenes, no official investigations, just a consistent pattern of withdrawal followed by absence. Different countries, different institutions, same trajectory. Colleagues compared timelines and found an unsettling similarity. Each disappearance occurred within a year of the individual's final listening session. Each had been present for at least one uninterrupted playback of the full signal. Each had expressed, in one form or another, a sense that the signal was not meant to be interpreted, but acknowledged. One former participant, who left the group early and cut off contact, later explained his decision in a rare interview. "I realized something was wrong when I stopped wanting answers," he said. "I didn't feel afraid. I felt finished." When asked what he meant, he refused to elaborate. Those who remained attempted to rationalize the pattern: stress, isolation, cognitive bias, the power of suggestion. Any explanation was preferable to the alternative. But privately, many of them had begun to think the same thought. The signal did not affect everyone. Only those who listened fully, only those who gave it their attention, uninterrupted. It did not coerce, it did not command, it simply completed something. One final note, discovered years later among the archived papers of a missing researcher, was written in the margins of a printed waveform analysis. The handwriting was steady, deliberate. "It isn't a message, it's a reminder." A reminder of what the note did not say. But after that, no more listening sessions were organized. Not because of fear, because no one could agree on what would happen if they continued. The signal would return again. That much was certain. And when it did, it would not require interpretation, only listeners. And history had already shown what happened to those who listened all the way through. Part 5: The Content. After the listener's attention returned to the signal itself, not to where it came from, not to who or what might have sent it, but to the one question that still seemed unanswered: what does it contain? By every conventional definition, the answer was simple: nothing. No speech, no symbols, no encoded images, coordinates, or instructions. Repeated analysis confirmed what had been known since the beginning. The signal carried no payload. It did not transmit data in any recognizable form. There was no compression, no encryption, no redundancy beyond what was required to preserve its own structure. And yet, no one who studied it seriously could accept that it was empty, because emptiness does not behave like this. The signal consisted of layered pulses, precise, evenly spaced, repeating in a pattern that never quite resolved into repetition. Each sequence echoed the last, but with subtle internal corrections, as if the signal were constantly adjusting itself to remain exactly what it already was. It was not evolving, it was maintaining. Analysts mapped the pulses visually, converting sound into structure. The resulting images were unsettling in their symmetry. Not simple symmetry, but recursive symmetry, patterns nested inside themselves, repeating at different scales. Zoom in and the structure remained. Zoom out and it was still there. The signal did not change with perspective. That alone made it unusual. Most natural phenomena reveal randomness under magnification. Most artificial ones reveal simplification. This did neither. Some researchers compared it to a checksum, a way of verifying integrity rather than conveying meaning. Others likened it to a heartbeat, though that metaphor failed under scrutiny. Heartbeats vary. They respond to stress, context, change. This signal did not respond. It simply asserted itself. Attempts were made to interpret the pulses mathematically. Ratios were calculated. Intervals were converted into numerical sequences. Entire teams searched for hidden relationships, prime numbers, constants, known physical values. Nothing aligned. Not because the math was wrong, but because it did not apply. The signal was not describing something else. It was describing itself. One analyst, frustrated after months of fruitless decoding, wrote in an internal note, "We are treating this like language, but language points away from itself. This doesn't." That observation reframed the entire discussion. Language communicates difference. This instead of that, now instead of then. But the signal made no distinctions. Every moment within it was equally necessary. Remove a pulse and the structure collapsed. Alter the timing and the pattern lost coherence. The signal could not be summarized. It could only be completed. That realization unsettled people more than any failed decoding attempt. Because if the signal could not be reduced, then it was not meant to be understood in parts. It was meant to be experienced as a whole. This explains something the listeners had struggled to articulate. Why stopping the playback early felt wrong. Why interruptions caused irritation disproportionate to the sound itself. Why the end of the signal felt less like a conclusion and more like a closure. The signal did not end, it resolved. Further analysis revealed that the final pulses were not quieter, slower, or weaker than the rest. But they carried a sense of finality, not through change, but through completion. The structure reached a point beyond which no continuation was possible without becoming something else. It was not a message concluding, it was a cycle closing. That distinction mattered. Messages are meant to be received and interpreted. They anticipate an audience, a response, a misunderstanding. This signal anticipated none of that. It behaved like a marker, like a seal. One researcher proposed a metaphor that circulated quietly among those still studying the phenomenon. The signal was not a letter, it was a timestamp. Not marking when something happened, but confirming that it had. That idea aligned with the most troubling aspect of the content, its indifference. The signal did not change based on who listened. It did not respond to repeated exposure. It did not degrade or adapt. Whether played once or 100 times, it remained identical. It did not care if it was understood. It did not care if it was heard, which meant the effect it had on listeners could not have been intentional in the way messages are intentional. If the signal caused something in those who listened, it was incidental, or worse, inevitable. One final attempt was made to extract meaning by comparing the signal to known temporal markers, atomic clock standards, GPS timing codes, pulsar emissions used for navigation. The similarities were superficial. Those systems exist to orient others. This did not. It oriented itself. At the end of the analysis phase, one conclusion remained. The signal contained no information because it did not need to. It was not telling anyone anything new. It was reminding of what? No one could say. But reminders only make sense if something has already been known, already agreed upon, already set in motion, which reframed the most disturbing question of all. If the signal is a reminder, who is it reminding? Not us. We do not remember what we have never known. And yet something in us reacts as if we should, as if the signal was confirming a condition we had already accepted long before we were aware of it. A reminder does not demand attention. It assumes it. And the signal, in all its empty precision, assumed that when the moment arrived, we would still be here to hear it. Part 6. The next cycle. Once the nature of the signal was understood, or rather once it was understood that it could never truly be understood, the question of the future could no longer be avoided. If the signal had appeared in 1957 and returned unchanged in 1987, then its rhythm was no longer theoretical. It was established. 30 years was not an approximation. It was an interval, a fixed distance between events, like the spacing between marks on a calendar no one remembered creating. This realization shifted the tone of every remaining discussion. The signal was no longer an anomaly to be explained, but a recurrence to be anticipated. And anticipation changed everything. Monitoring protocols were quietly adjusted. Certain stations began maintaining long-term surveillance on the frequency, not continuously, but with heightened attention as the next projected window approached. No public announcement was made. No formal task force was established. There was nothing to announce. The signal did not require preparation. It would arrive whether anyone was watching or not. As the projected year drew closer, interest resurfaced among a new generation of analysts, some of whom had only encountered the signal as a footnote in obscure reports. To them, it was a curiosity, a mathematical oddity, a mystery waiting to be solved with better tools. They were confident. Technology had advanced. Data processing was faster. Global synchronization was routine. Surely, this time, something would be different. The older researchers said very little. Those who had listened before understood something the reports did not capture. The signal does not change. We do. When the next cycle arrived, there was no fanfare, no global alert, no surge in activity. The signal appeared on schedule, exactly where it was expected, with the same duration, the same structure, the same indifference to observation. Once again, it did not arrive. It asserted itself. Once again, triangulation failed. Once again, analysis revealed nothing new, but something else had changed. More people were watching, not because they had been warned, but because the pattern had become impossible to ignore. Automated systems logged the event. Private researchers shared timestamps. Amateur radio enthusiasts noticed a silence where static should have been, followed by something too precise to dismiss. The signal was no longer confined to closed archives. It was being noticed. And some people listened. They were not part of any formal group. They did not coordinate. They found the signal through curiosity, rumor, or accident. And those who listened described the same things. Not shock, not fear, recognition, the sense that the signal was not interrupting their lives, but aligning with them. That it was not imposing something new, but confirming something already in motion. Online discussions appeared briefly, then vanished. Accounts were deleted. Threads went silent. Those who remained spoke carefully, as if unsure which details were safe to share. One post, archived before it disappeared, read, "It doesn't feel like the signal is happening now. It feels like now is happening because of it." That idea spread quietly, without attribution. As the cycle ended, the signal withdrew as it always had, cleanly, without residue. The frequency returned to static. Systems drifted. Clocks resumed their minor disagreements. To most of the world, nothing had happened. But to those paying attention, the meaning of the future had shifted. The next cycle was no longer an abstract projection. It was scheduled. The date was known. And that knowledge introduced a new kind of tension, not urgency, but inevitability. People began to mark time differently. 30 years was no longer just a span. It was a countdown embedded in calendars, careers, lifespans. Some realized they would not be alive to hear the next return. Others realized they would. A few began to prepare, not by building equipment or gathering data, but by making sure they would be listening. That distinction mattered, because by now, it was clear the signal did not reward preparation. It did not reveal itself more fully to better instruments or sharper minds. It simply appeared. And when it did not ask who was ready. It only checked who remained. In that sense, the signal behaved less like a warning and more like a ritual, one that did not require belief, participation, or consent, only continuity. The cycle would repeat, whether or not it was recorded, whether or not it was analyzed, whether or not anyone was left who remembered the previous ones. The signal did not preserve history. It tested presence. And as the moment passed and the world moved forward, one truth settled quietly among those who understood the pattern. The signal would return again. Not because something was beginning, but because something had never stopped. Closing, the reminder. By the time you learn about the signal, it has already done what it was meant to do, not because it was hidden, but because it does not announce itself. The signal does not arrive with urgency. It does not demand belief, attention, or understanding. It does not persuade. It does not warn. It does not threaten. It simply returns, and in returning, it confirms something that has always been true. This is what unsettles those who study it the longest. Not the mystery of its origin, nor the precision of its timing, but its certainty. The signal behaves as though the future is not uncertain, as though the next cycle is not a possibility, but a memory waiting to repeat itself. It does not ask whether anyone is listening, it assumes someone will be. That assumption reframes everything. Because reminders are not sent to strangers. They are sent to those who have already agreed to something, to a schedule, a condition, a rule they no longer remember accepting. The signal is not teaching us anything. It is checking that the world is still here, that the frequency still exists, that something is still capable of receiving it. Those who listened most closely understood this too late. They searched for meaning where none was required. They tried to interpret what was never meant to be interpreted. The signal does not explain, it verifies, and verification only matters if there is something to verify against. Perhaps that is why the signal leaves no trace when it ends. No residue, no distortion. It does not change the world, it confirms it. For 6 minutes and 42 seconds, everything aligns. Time, structure, presence. Then the moment passes, and life resumes, slightly unaware that it has just been measured. The next return is already set. It does not matter who remembers the previous cycles. It does not matter who prepares. It does not matter who believes. The signal will not be early, it will not be late, and when it comes, it will not speak, because it has nothing new to say. Only one thing to remind us of, that this moment has happened before, that it will happen again, and that for now, we are still here to hear it.
Shadows crawl